The forest at the edge of eastern Poland had always been quiet in winter, but in early 1944, its silence felt heavier, almost deliberate. The pines stood tall and motionless, their dark silhouettes rising against a dull gray sky. Snow blanketed everything in a cold, suffocating hush. Even the wind, usually free to prowl between the trees, seemed to move cautiously, as if fearful of disturbing something hidden beneath the surface. What the Germans never realized was that the forest was hiding something. Buried beneath a thicket of old roots and frozen soil lay the entrance to a narrow wooden shaft no larger than a cellar door, camouflaged with pine branches carefully arranged by hand. Below it stretched a cramped underground room, barely tall enough for a grown man to stand. The air was stale but warm, lit only by a dim oil lamp hung from a beam overhead. Inside, 5 members of the Polish Underground Home Army huddled around a rough wooden table. On its surface lay an object far more dangerous than any weapon. A small metal cylinder, no longer than a thumb, containing microfilm smuggled from the Western Front. It held intercepted German dispatches detailing troop movements, fuel shortages, and the desperate shifts within the Wehrmacht's crumbling eastern line. But the true threat wasn't the microfilm, it was how it had arrived. It had been extracted and copied using an optical device hidden inside something no German patrol had ever suspected: a hand-carved wooden violin. The instrument now lay in its battered case beside the table. To any soldier, it would appear to be a simple old fiddle owned by a village musician. Its strings were worn, its body polished unevenly with age, but beneath the soundboard, behind a layer of expertly carved wooden lattice, lay a secret compartment engineered by a sympathetic luthier in Norway. It was there that the microfilm cylinder had traveled across 3 checkpoints, 2 occupied towns, and through a railway station crawling with Gestapo agents. The man who had brought it, Marek Borkowski, a former street performer, leaned against the wall, catching his breath. His fingers, calloused from years spent playing music in markets and taverns, trembled slightly as he pushed back his cap. 3 patrols, he whispered. 2 on foot, 1 with dogs. They searched everyone, except the ones playing music for coins. He forced a tired smile, but the others did not return it. The room felt too tight, the air too thin for celebration. They all knew what this meant. The Germans had increased security. Something had changed. Captain Jen Shemek, the eldest of the group, unrolled a map patched together out of newspaper scraps and old linen. "They're expecting sabotage," he muttered. "We must assume they're already aware of activity in this region." He tapped the map near a marked rail line. If this microfilm is correct, a German train carrying radio components is scheduled to pass through It's lightly guarded, but the cargo is essential for repairing their long-range communication network. Marek stepped forward, and destroying it would slow them down by weeks. Jan nodded, but his expression grew grave. "Only if we can get this information out of the forest." To the Allied relay point, a heavy silence settled over the group. Because to reach the relay point, someone would have to trek back through the forest past the new checkpoints, past the dogs, past the Gestapo inspectors who had begun tearing apart carts, violins, barrels, and baskets in search of hidden documents. The microfilm could not be carried in a satchel. It could not be hidden in clothing. It could not be buried or sent by courier. There was only one method left. Everyone turned to the violin. Marek swallowed hard. He had risked his life once already, but as the others watched him, he felt the weight of their unspoken question. Would he do it again? He looked down at the instrument, running a thumb across its scratches. It had been his companion long before the war. Now it had become a lifeline for dozens of resistance networks. He finally spoke. "I'll take it." No one breathed for several seconds. The forest above seemed to lean closer. Listening, Jan placed a hand on Marek's shoulder. If the Germans catch you, they will tear apart that violin splinter by splinter." "I know," Marek said softly, "but they won't catch me." Outside, a distant sound broke the silence, a crack of ice, followed by faint footsteps. Not one pair of several, the Germans were already in the forest. Marek grabbed the violin, slung it over his back, and moved toward the ladder leading up into the freezing dark. He didn't hesitate, because in war, even a fragile instrument could become the most dangerous object on the battlefield, and the Germans were close enough to hear its silence. The cold hit Marek like a physical blow as he pushed the camouflaged hatch open and emerged into the forest. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the thin moonlight filtering through the trees. The pines loomed like dark sentries, their snow-laden branches hanging low and unmoving. The world felt suspended quiet, brittle, waiting. He lowered the hatch until it sat flush with the frozen ground, brushing pine needles over it with gloved hands until the entrance looked as untouched as the rest of the forest floor. Then he exhaled slowly, sending a thin plume of vapor curling upward. In his left hand, he held the violin case. He cradled it carefully, even though it looked like any other worn instrument. The violin inside had survived taverns, market squares, train platforms, and German checkpoints, often in plain sight. No one questioned a street performer. No one imagined an instrument could carry information capable of altering troop deployments. But now, Marek wasn't walking into a town or checkpoint. He was walking into the forest to a tightening net. He started moving, boots crunching softly through the layers of powder. Every step had to be deliberate. Patrols moved unpredictably at night, especially now that German command suspected resistance activity in the region. The Gestapo had recently enforced new protocols: random searches, bag inspections, and the use of dogs trained specifically to detect unfamiliar scents on wood and fabric. Marek's stomach tightened. Would the dogs smell the violin's hidden compartment? He pushed the thought away. He needed to focus. He path to the rendezvous point wound through several kilometers of dense forest, across a frozen stream, then up a ridge where a narrow hunting trail overlooked a railway road. If he reached the ridge before dawn, he could watch for patrol movements and adjust his route. If he didn't, he forced himself not to finish the thought. A low whistle echoed through the trees. Marek sank into a crouch instantly. His breath froze in his throat. The whistle came again to short notes, then silence. It wasn't birdsong. It wasn't the wind. It was a signal. A German one. He remained motionless, fingers tightening around the violin case. After a moment, he heard voices, muffled but growing clearer. Two men, speaking German. Their tone was conversational, almost lazy. A patrol, no doubt, but close. Too close. Marek pressed his back against the trunk of a pine, pulling his coat tighter. Through the branches, he saw two soldiers, emerge, a Hauptmann and a Private Rafals, slung casually over their shoulders. They walked slowly, scanning the trees, but not with urgency. They weren't hunting someone specific. Not yet. The officer paused to strike a match, lighting a cigarette. The glow illuminated his face, revealing tired eyes and a calm expression. For a moment, Marek felt the absurd temptation to believe he could simply walk past them and say he was out gathering firewood. People did it all the time. But then the private spoke. "They've ordered instrument checks at the checkpoints," he said in German. "Violins, accordions, even church organs." The officer exhaled. Smoke. "Ridiculous. What do they think? The Poles are hiding bombs and fiddles." "Not bombs," the private muttered. "They say documents. Codes. Something small." Marek felt his blood turn to ice. The officer took another drag and shrugged. "We will check when we must. But here..." He gestured at the vast forest. No musician walks these woods at night. The two men resumed walking, their voices fading into the distance. Merrick waited until he could no longer hear their boots before he rose slowly, gripping the violin case so tightly his knuckles whitened. They knew they didn't know everything, but they knew enough. He continued north, keeping to the trees, his senses sharpened, listening to every crack, every shift of snow. The forest felt alive now, no longer a shelter but a labyrinth with moving walls. After an hour he reached the frozen stream. The ice groaned beneath his boots, but he crossed quickly, careful not to slip. On the far bank, he knelt beside a fallen birch tree to adjust his scarf and froze. Footprints, fresh ones, not his. They led toward the ridge he needed to reach. Someone else was on that route, someone with a heavier gait, likely carrying equipment. A German radio operator, a scout, or another resistance courier. He couldn't assume. Not tonight. He gripped the violin case and stepped into the tracks, following them silently, matching each print. If a patrol turned to look behind them, they'd see only one continuous trail. The forest tightened around him as he advanced, the trees growing closer together, the branches thicker. Above him, a raven coda, rare sound at night. He didn't like the omen. He pressed forward anyway, because somewhere ahead, in the darkness, was the only path that could get the microfilm man to the truth it carried out of the forest. But he wasn't alone on that path anymore. Snow drifted softly against the entrance of the abandoned stone farmhouse as Ingrid pushed the heavy wooden door shut behind them. Inside, the air was cold but still like a tomb that had been waiting for decades. Eric struck a match, cupping the flame with his hands until the small oil lamp flickered alive, casting long shapes across the cracked walls. The farmhouse belonged to Ingrid's grandparents once. Before the occupation, before German patrols turned every isolated shelter into a potential trap, before a hidden world of resistance work began to take shape underneath their feet. "Help me move this table," Ingrid whispered. Together, they slid aside a thick oak table, worn smooth by generations of hands. Beneath it, half buried in frost and dust, was a stone plate slightly darker than the rest of the floor. Ingrid knelt, brushed away the snow crust, and pressed her fingers into a small groove. A hollow click echoed. Eric froze. You weren't joking. The stone lifted just enough for him to grab the edge. He heaved it aside, unveiling a narrow stairway spiraling into darkness. "The Germans searched this house last winter," Ingrid whispered as they descended. "They never found this." Below, the stairway opened into a cramped chamber barely tall enough for a grown man to stand. Lanterns hung from iron hooks. A small wooden desk sat beside a stack of crates labeled in faded ink. The air smelled of dust, paper, and long-forgotten secrets. Eric knelt beside one of the crates. Inside were metal tubes, sealed packets of microfilm, and folded sheets of thin parchment maps. Not ordinary maps. These were hand-drawn communication grids linking remote farms, fishing shacks, and hunting cabins throughout the countryside. Each location marked not by names, but by coded symbols. "This is a full contact network," Eric murmured. "One the Germans haven't discovered." Footsteps thudded above. Both froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. The creak of boots on old timber. Eric grabbed Ingrid and pulled her under the staircase just as dust trickled down from the ceiling. A muffled German voice called out from the upper floor, followed by a second sharper, more impatient. The dogs must have picked up a trace. Maybe from the trail, maybe from a dropped glove. Another bootstep, another creak. Eric whispered, "If they find a hatch—" "They won't," Ingrid said, though her eyes betrayed her fear. "It's disguised as part of the foundation. My grandfather built it that way, but the Germans were thorough." A loud thump, something heavy, dragged across the floor above. "The table?" They had found it. The two resistance members pressed against the cold stone wall, barely breathing. The voices grew louder, sharper, closer to the trapdoor. Ingrid's pulse hammered in her ears. Eric placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Another thump. Then silence. A tense second passed. Then another. Then another. Eric leaned forward, listening. Suddenly, a German soldier shouted something crude. Another replied. Boots stomped toward the doorway. A slam. The wind howled in again as the farmhouse door opened, then closed. The patrol was gone. Ingrid finally exhaled, trembling. We don't have much time. Eric, look at this. She held up a sealed package she had pulled from the crate. Inside was a small, triangular device made of metal and two thin copper wires. It's a fragment of a portable transmitter, Eric said. One of the old SO models? No, Ingrid whispered. It's more than that. On the back of the packet was a handwritten inscription in Norwegian. Deliver only to those who still believe the Northern Line can be saved. Eric stared at her. The Northern Line? I thought it was destroyed. Everyone did. That was the point. Eric set the lamp down and spread out the maps across the table. The hand-drawn grid revealed a path leading north through forests, frozen lakes, and valleys carved by ancient rivers. A dangerous route, but one that avoided every major German checkpoint. A communication line still alive. If true, it meant something staggering. There were resistance cells still active in the far north, isolated, silent, but not extinguished. And they were waiting. For us? Eric asked softly. For anyone left? Ingrid answered. She stepped closer to the crates, digging deeper. More packets. More metal components. More tubes of enough to build several working field radios. Eric shook his head. This is a relay station. Built years ago, before the Germans tightened control. Before the Gestapo arrived, and my grandparents kept it alive. He lifted a microfilm tube to the light and froze. Ingrid, this is an intelligence transfer. It contains coordinates. She looked at him, breath visible in the dim light. What coordinates? Eric swallowed. German fuel depots, ammunition caches, officer barracks, all across the upper region. A slow, creeping realization filled the room. If they delivered this information to the right people, the entire German northern frontier could collapse. But there was something else, a faint, rhythmic vibration through the stone floor. Eric and Ingrid exchanged a terrified glance. Vehicles. Approaching, fast. Ingrid closed the hatch above the chamber and blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed them both. Eric, she whispered. They're coming back. He gripped the packet tightly. Then, we move now. Snow fell in a slow, steady curtain over the abandoned rail yard, blanketing the rusted tracks and muffling every sound as if the entire world had been wrapped in cotton. Lieutenant Eric Halvorsen crouched behind an overturned freight cart, pressing his gloved hand against the icy steel to steady his breath. Every exhale came out as a ghostly plume, dissolving into the darkness. To anyone passing by, the rail yard looked deserted. Another forgotten industrial skeleton left behind by the collapse of Norway's early war infrastructure, but Eric knew better. Somewhere in that maze of ruined cargo containers, shattered windows, and frozen rail lines, a German signal intercept unit was setting up a temporary post, and if they succeeded in tracking the resistance transmission scheduled for that night, the entire underground network in the region would unravel. The irony was lost on him. For months, the resistance had been smuggling tiny radio components hidden in fishing baskets, hollowed-out knitting needles, and even children's toys. They had built portable transmitters smaller than a loaf of bread, and yet, Tonight, their survival depended on preventing the Germans from picking up a single burst of encrypted Morse. The mission was simple on paper. Find the intercept team, disable their equipment, leave no trace. But Eric could already tell nothing about this night would be simple. He scanned the Germans had chosen the location wisely open space, long lines of sight, multiple escape routes, and plenty of metal structures that could mask equipment signatures from Allied aerial reconnaissance. Their generator, if active, would be buried deep inside one of the larger maintenance sheds. A faint hum flickered through the cold air, not loud, not constant, just a low electrical vibration, rising and falling like a heartbeat, the kind only a trained operator could detect. Eric's instincts sharpened. The generator was already running. He motioned to Ingrid, the team's radio engineer, who had been silently crawling along the rail tracks. She stopped beside him, her breath quick and shallow. "You hear it too?" she whispered. He nodded. Ingrid tightened the strap of her toolkit. She was small, wiry, and impossibly brave. While the rest of the unit carried weapons, she carried coils of wire, insulated cutters, and a screwdriver worn smooth by years of clandestine repairs. She was the only one who could disable the German intercept device without setting off alarms, and she was the only one who knew how much time they had left. A signal burst was scheduled at 2:15. It was now 1:48. 27 minutes until catastrophe. Eric raised two fingers. Move. The team slipped deeper into the Ray Yard 4 shadows, navigating an ocean of steel. Their boots barely pressed into the snow. Even the wind seemed to hush itself as they advanced. But the Germans were not careless. A sharp floodlight cut across the far end of the yard. Voices boot, the clatter of a rifle sling. A patrol. Eric pulled Ingrid and the others into the narrow gap between two derailed tanker cars just in time. The German soldiers passed within arm's reach, laughing about something, voices casual, unguarded. They had no idea a resistance team was inches away. But then one of them stopped, head bent down, peered at the snow, pointed. Footprints. Eric felt every muscle in his body tense, but he forced his breathing to slow. Stillness was life. Seconds stretched into full minutes. Finally, the soldier shrugged, muttered something about old tracks, and the patrol kept moving. Only when their footsteps faded did Eric signal the team to continue. They approached the largest maintenance shed, windows boarded from the inside, roof patched with sheets of corrugated metal, a thin halo of light leaking through a crack beneath the door. Inside, the intercept team would have set up a portable, Enigma-connected cipher line, a directional antenna rig, a reel-to-reel signal recorder, and the dreaded R75 frequency analyzer, a device capable of triangulating resistance transmissions within minutes. Eric felt a pulse of dread. If that analyzer finished calibrating, evacuating the entire network might not be enough. The Germans would hunt them down signal by signal, village by village, transmitter by transmitter. He pressed his ear to the wall. Voices murmured in sidecom, confident, in control. Ingrid whispered, "If they're calibrating, I need 10 minutes to break it. Maybe less." "We won't have 10 minutes," Eric replied quietly. They both knew the truth. Once inside, everything depended on precision. One mistake, one loud step, one broken wire. Gestapo reinforcements could arrive from the highway checkpoint in under 5 minutes. But there was no time left to hesitate. Eric drew a slow breath, letting the cold bite into his lungs. "On my signal," he murmured, "we end the night before they begin it." He raised his hand, then lowered it. The team moved as one, and the night itself seemed to tremble. The fog settled low over the shattered streets as dawn pushed a pale, reluctant light across the broken rooftops. Smoke still curled upward from the ruined, thin, ghost-like strands. drifting into the quiet morning. It was the first sunrise the town had seen without the sound of boots, trucks, or shouted orders from occupying soldiers. Yet it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. The air was too heavy for that. Inside what little remained of the town's library, Eric stood among the collapsed beams and fractured stone, brushing dust from his coat as if trying to shake off the past 2 years along with it. The once grand shelves had been reduced to tangled wood and burnt paper, but in the center of the debris, one shelf still stood upright, something the retreating Germans had missed. Eric allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Some stories refused to die. Behind him, Ingrid limped into the room, her right leg wrapped with makeshift bandages from injuries suffered during the final escape. She winced, but forced herself to walk with dignity. Ingrid had always moved, like someone who wanted the world to see strength before pain. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Eric glanced toward the open doorway, where distant echoes of Allied vehicles rolled through the valley. "For the town," he answered. "Not for the story." Ingrid moved beside him, lowering herself to sit on a half-collapsed beam. "After everything, you're still thinking about the archives?" "I'm thinking," he said, brushing a fragment of charred manuscript from the dirt, "about what the Germans tried to erase." He turned the fragment over in his hand. It was the last scrap of the coded ledger the Resistance archivists had protected from a ledger that chronicled the names of every spy, every courier, every villager who had risked their life to keep information flowing past German checkpoints. The Nazis had wanted it destroyed more than anything. They knew that stories could outlive armies. Ingrid's voice soft. "Do you think anyone will ever know what happened here?" "That depends on whether we write it," Eric replied. Outside, the sound of boots approached, this time slow, steady, familiar. 2 Allied soldiers stepped through the archway where the library doors had once stood. They looked weary, their uniforms smudged with smoke and earth, but their expressions eased when they saw the 2 Norwegians alive. One soldier removed his helmet and nodded respectfully. "We got your signal. Germans retreated from the ridge late last night. Your transmissions saved more people than you know." Ingrid exhaled shakily. "Then the radio wasn't for nothing." "No," the soldier said. "It wasn't." He handed Eric a canvas Puchera-covered equipment the Resistance had hidden before the final night. Inside were the remains of the portable transmitter, cracked wires, metal fragments, a broken crystal piece, and the tiny coded sheet Jonas had died to deliver. Eric closed his fingers around it. The soldier hesitated, then added, "We also found something else, a note left near the ridge." Eric unfolded the mud-stained paper. Only one sentence was still legible. "If the story survives, then so do we." He felt a tightness in his throat. It was Magnus S., handwriting the archivist, who never made it back from the last mission. Ingrid placed a hand on his shoulder. The Allied soldier stepped back politely. "We'll give you both a few minutes." When they were alone again, Ingrid looked toward the broken shelves. "What happens now?" Eric carefully placed the fragment of the ledger into a dry cloth, wrapping it the same way Magnus once wrapped every precious document, slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Now," he said, "we rebuild the archive." Ingrid raised an eyebrow. "In a library that no longer exists, in any place that can hold memory," he answered. "Stories don't need walls. They need people who remember." She smiled faintly. "Then we start with this town." "No," Eric corrected gently, looking toward the horizon where the morning light finally broke through the fog. "We start with every town the world forgot." They stepped outside together. The streets smelled of wet ash and thawing snow, but life, quiet, fragile life, was beginning to return. Children ventured out from cellars. Mothers searched through rubble for keepsakes. Old men stood in doorways, blinking at the daylight like they were seeing it for the first time. Eric and Ingrid walked slowly toward the square where the first Allied vehicles were unloading supplies. A medic stopped to hand Ingrid a clean bandage. Another soldier offered Eric a small notebook. "For your records," he said with a warm, tired smile. Eric accepted the notebook with the reverence of someone holding a sacred object. He turned the first page, then the second, pure white, untouched, a fresh start for the stories that deserve to live. As they continued forward, Ingrid asked, "What'll you call it?" "The archive." Eric paused, letting the question settle in the cold air. Then he answered, with quiet certainty, "The archive of the unspoken war. Everything they tried to silence. We'll write it." In that moment across the ruined town square, a single church bell rang, the first sound of peace the village had heard in years. Its echo traveled across stone, through the valley, and up the mountains, where so many voices had been lost. This time, the echo would not fade. It would be remembered.